Spider-Man!
What? Spider-Man? Where? Where?
It's 1994, and Marvel is on the brink of extinction. Although its characters were still recognizable, comics weren't selling, and the company was having trouble appealing to young potential fans, putting them on the verge of bankruptcy. It was at this precarious moment in superhero history, Spider-Man the Animated Series was born, and on a personal note, where I became a lifelong Spidey fan. The series introduced the Queen's native web singer to a new generation, as there hadn't been a new Spider-Man series in over a decade. It's easy to take for granted the ubiquity and mass appeal of Spider-Man for those of you born a little later, given that X-Men and Spider-Man kicked off the massive boom of superhero movies.
Who are you?
You know who I am.
I do.
Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
But for kids like me who were born in the 80s, this was Spider-Man. And coincidentally enough, it was also preceded by X-Men the Animated Series, which, let's be honest, laid the foundation for series like this one and those that came after it.
I know how you feel about it, Wolverine, but...
Spider-Man the Animated Series may have entered the world in an uncertain future, but it diligently and faithfully introduced new fans to Spidey and provided an awesome springboard into full-fledged comics fandom, all while still finding time to be funny.
Green ball in the center pocket.
Here's everything you didn't know about Spider-Man the Animated Series. Spider-Man the Animated Series premiered on November 19th, 1994 on Fox Kids, where it had a 5-season, 65-episode run, finaleing on January 31st, 1998. I was still in junior high school. The show introduces us to Peter Parker a little later than most Spidey narratives, and it skipped the origin story. Rather than starting Peter as a high schooler getting bitten by a radioactive spider, the animated series starts Peter already as a well-established Spider-Man and a college student at Empire State University, which didn't happen in the Amazing Spider-Man comics until issue 31. The Peter we meet is a self-assured superhero.
Well, if it isn't a meeting of the Diamond Lovers of America.
On point in the science department.
Temperature alpha. Respiration alpha.
Getting paid in the photo department.
Where did you get this?
I sold an exclusive photo to the Daily Bugle.
And a little funky in the romance department.
Dinner with you would be a date, and dates are for boyfriends. Please don't be offended, Parker.
And a reliable source of puns and terrible jokes.
This lizard thing is probably just an urban myth. Wait a minute, looks like I was myth-taken.
Over the course of the series, Spider-Man squared off against the majority of his most famous villains. Green Goblin, Venom, Scorpion, Dr. Octopus, Hobgoblin, Kingpin, Carnage, Mysterio, I mean, the list goes on.
Enough!
Peter's usual friends and supporting players are there as well. Pete's main love interest, Mary Jane Watson.
Mary Jane Watson, fabulous supermodel.
Aunt May, who looks and sounds like she's 100 years old.
You followed Spider-Man into the sewer, didn't you?
J. Jonah Jameson.
I finally got that wall-crawling sack of garbage.
Who's a bit more murderous towards Spider-Man than the J.K. Simmons character from the Sam Raimi movies.
I want him strung up by his web!
Think more like J.K. Simmons in Whiplash.
You are a worthless, friendless, lip little piece of
The show also features Spider mainstays Flash Thompson, Robbie Robertson, and Felicia Hardy, who's a major love interest for Peter before MJ hits the scene, and who also turns out to be the alluring Black Cat.
Who are you?
Just a stray black cat.
Spider-Man the Animated Series also features some serious Marvel crossover action in a kind of animated proto-MCU, taking a cue from the crossovers in X-Men the Animated Series, spearheaded by cartoon MVP Larry Houston. For more on that, make sure you check out our full video on that story. Spider-Man featured tussles and team-ups with the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, the X-Men, Daredevil, Doctor Strange, the Punisher, and Captain America. I'm partial to the Blade episodes myself, but that's just me.
Drop the human now, Night Stalker!
Spider-Man the Animated Series wasn't necessarily the first animated spider show to do the team-up thing. 1981, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends featured a lot of that, but what was new was the method. While Amazing Friends featured lots of different Marvel characters, they intersected in one-off sitcom-style plots.
Captain America, at your service, ladies!
In Spider-Man the Animated Series, by contrast, crossover characters were part of a whole arc and drew closely from the comics. More on that soon. The show also featured a wide swath of perspectives Spider-Man can occupy as a superhero. From small-stakes, wisecracking New York sewer brawling...
You don't find the Fantastic Four in a sewer, or the Avengers.
...to cosmic struggles involving multiple timelines.
You mean to tell me that you all share my life? And my spider powers?
Spider-Man also wasn't afraid to get serious. Peter confronted terrible loss in the series when Mary Jane disappeared, and then lost her a second time when he found out her clone wasn't the real her.
If any part of me is anything like the real Mary Jane Watson, she loves Peter Parker more than anything in the world. More than anything.
Hits you right here. But like any cartoon from our childhood, the show has a lot of stuff for us to lovingly poke fun at too. For example, in the pilot, a subway worker has a terrifying encounter in the dark with a pair of scary eyes. And Spider-Man not only doesn't believe this, he treats the dude like he's crazy.
The red eyes after me.
Uh-huh. And did they belong to little pink elephants?
You're a man who can crawl up walls.
Sure, pal. Whatever you say.
Or how about when Jonah offers a $1,000 bonus to whoever gets a photo of the lizard?
Color or black and white?
That's funny because now you're lucky if you get a $1,000 salary working in journalism. That's actually not funny. Support journalism, y'all.
Yeah, whatever.
But my favorite funny trope from Spider-Man has to be the narrating of plot dynamics out loud.
Strange. So strange. A week ago, this creature was a scientist.
Okay, come on. He's fully monologuing while fighting for his life underwater. Focus, Pete. When it comes to the intro theme, there's a few people we need to thank. First, the writers of the original Spider-Man theme song that everyone knows that's being sampled here, written by Paul Francis Webster and Bob Harris. You know, the one about the guy who does whatever a spider can?
Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies.
Fun fact, the writers received no residuals for their song, just the money they got for the original recording session. So yeah, that fun fact wasn't fun at all. The man who arranged Spider-Man the Animated Series' theme is Shuki Levy, who is an absolute legend. Spectre Gadget, Mask, He-Man, She-Ra, Power Rangers were all written by him. Like I said, legend. And then perhaps the strangest of all, the intro features guitar and vocals from none other than Aerosmith's Joe Perry.
How about that guy from Aerosmith?
Which I guess is fitting since there's an Aerosmith roller coaster at Disney World and Disney owns Marvel now. Wait, does that mean they own Aerosmith too? As we mentioned, Spider-Man the Animated Series had a really intimate connection to Spider-Man's comic book mythos. Lots of cartoon shows from the 80s and 90s based on well-known characters had lots of creative latitude to do their own world building, often to the point of absurdity, and we're not knocking them for that. Some truly hilarious stuff came out of that approach, but at the end of the day, those writers were making shows for kids.
Amazing.
Yeah, you can say that again.
But Spider-Man treated its young viewers like would-be comic book readers, which Marvel was hoping would actually happen too. Christopher Daniel Barnes, the actor who played Peter Parker, even recorded his voice for some digital versions of classic Spider-Man comics to encourage fans crossing over from the cartoon into the comics. Holy crap, you guys remember books and cassettes? The main way that Spider-Man the Animated Series brought viewers into the world of comics was by telling iconic stories drawn from the Spider-Man comic books. Now that doesn't mean the show's writers didn't create their own interpretations of those stories. They were adapting and making changes, not transcribing. But there is hardly a single episode of the series that isn't connected to a story told in a Spider-Man comic, and many major arcs and events from Spider-Man comics history are reproduced in the show. We don't have time to look at anything close to all of them, but let's highlight a few. The infamous death of Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man 121 was recreated by Spider-Man the Animated Series in the episode Turning Point, with Mary Jane being tossed off the George Washington Bridge instead of Gwen. Note that the bridge drawn in the show is actually the George Washington Bridge, while in the comic it's the Brooklyn Bridge, even though it's not referred to at all. Season 5, Episode 1, The Wedding, is based on the famous Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 21. In the show, they added a plot with the Green Goblin and downplayed the whole marital doubt thing going on in the comic. But that's understandable considering the audience of the show. They're kids. Episodes 9, 10, and 11 of Season 5 adapted the Secret Wars Marvel crossover comics event from 1984. While the show adaptation might not have had quite as many characters featured as the comic, it still had a bunch, including the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Captain America, and Storm. And let's do one more just for and gigs. The first 2 episodes of Season 2 are based on Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 1, which featured the Sinister Six. But the show renamed them the Insidious Six because the producers feared that the word sinister was too inappropriate for kids. Sinister, insidious, either way, you're helping kids study for the SAT way too early. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that the Spider-Wars multi-episode arc in some ways is a precursor to last year's Into the Spider-Verse. As for the production history of Spider-Man the Animated Series, we've got to give a huge shout out to Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man. Some of you may be saying, yeah, duh, we already know this, in which case, go talk in the comments. But for everyone else, Stan Lee came up with the name and the idea of a teenager turned spider hero, but Ditko came up with the costume and fleshed out the character. Spider-Man the Animated Series was produced under the newly created Marvel Films Animation Division, a semi-independent entity that was intended to function like the later Marvel Studios, except it ended up being way less successful. Spider-Man was the only show ever produced under that brand.
I understand, but I'm hurt.
Marvel Animation originally had ambitious plans for the show, including the new technology of computer-generated 3D animation, but most of this was scrapped as it became way too expensive. But some does remain in the show in shots when Spidey is web-slinging around the city. If you're a resident of New York City like I am, you might notice that a lot of the architecture and vistas look pretty accurate. That's because the animators did a lot of research and referenced a lot of photography. They wanted to get the look and feel just right, and I think they nailed it.
Nice view.
ARAD, serving as Marvel's chief creative officer at the time, executive produced the show. Today, he produces major Hollywood studio movies. All but one episode of Spider-Man was directed by Bob Richardson, who was a lifelong animation pro and an alum of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. He also directed 84 episodes of Muppet Babies. I love that show. There are 41 total credited writers for the show on IMDb. John Semper is credited with the most individual episodes, which makes sense because I remember his name from seeing it at the beginning of almost every single episode. He was also a producer and is responsible for a lot of the comics-inspired arc storytelling within the show. He later go on to work as a writer and story editor on Static Shock.
The name's Static.
Love that show too. Len Wein wrote 2 episodes and is an icon in Marvel Comics history. He co-created some of the X-Men's most famous characters, including Wolverine and Storm. He also co-created Swamp Thing for DC. Jerry Conway, who created The Punisher, wrote 1 episode, as did Mark Wolfman, who created dozens of Marvel and DC characters, including Black Cat, Nightwing, Starfire, and more. Among the other writers for Spider-Man, many went on to write for the iconic shows of the DC animated universe of the late 90s and 2000s. The cast was anchored by Christopher Daniel Barnes as the voice of Peter Parker / Spider-Man.
Look, Aunt May, I've really gotta go.
He played Greg Brady in the Brady Bunch movies.
You're the best sister a guy never had. No, ever had.
Chuck Brady in the sitcom Day by Day, and Prince Eric in The Little Mermaid. As a voice actor, he nailed every important aspect of who Peter Parker was and what he was going through at the time. Although sometimes the man could get pretty intense. Even Shocker's all like, dude, take it down a notch.
I'll chase you to the ends of the earth!
Now, some would call that overacting. I would call that unmoderated passion. Sarah Ballantyne voiced Mary Jane.
Be careful, Tiger. I love you.
While MJ was her biggest role, she did also play a nurse in the Eddie Murphy movie, Nutty Professor.
I'm getting out of here!
The cast of Spider-Man is notable for having some industry veterans among the smaller parts. J. Jonah Jameson was played by Mary Tyler Moore Show veteran Ed Asner, but you probably remember him better as Santa in Elf or this cranky dude. Martin Landau, a Hollywood icon in 7 different decades, played Scorpion.
Who the heck are you?
A real hero, you freak!
A guy by the name of Mark Hamill voiced the Hobgoblin.
What a nice surprise!
Hamill's, of course, best known outside of Spider-Man for his contribution of the voice of Buzz Buzzard in 1999's The Woody Woodpecker Show.
I'm crushed! How the high and mighty forget.
Joan Lee, the wife of Stan Lee, played Madam Web. And she even appeared in the same episode as her husband, voicing the creator in the finale of the series, which is actually pretty darn sweet.
It's time to go.
Who is that exotic lady?
Simpsons legend Hank Azaria voiced Eddie Brock.
Don't blame me, blame Spider-Man.
Roscoe Lee Brown voiced the Kingpin.
Who would have thought that Spider-Man would ever prove useful to me?
Who also had a major role in the movie Logan's Run. Jennifer Hale voiced Felicia Hardy and would go on to do voice work for a ton more animation shows like Clone Wars, Avatar The Last Airbender, The Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, and more.
Felicia.
Oh, Parker.
Joseph Campanella voiced Kirk Connors.
Mary Jane, at the count of 3, I will snap my fingers and you must wake up.
He was a 60s and 70s TV mainstay with roles on The Fugitive and Mannix. Majel Barrett voiced Peter Parker's #1 hater, Anna Watson.
You can't put your life in danger just because of Peter's disregard for his own safety.
She was part of the cast of the original Star Trek and was also in the original Westworld.
Shut down. Shut down immediately.
Okay, the new Westworld show is definitely better. Many viewers of Spider-Man the Animated Series might be surprised that Hobgoblin is the main villain of Season 1 instead of Spidey's more typical main Goblin nemesis, the Green Goblin. The switch happened because a Fire producer had insisted on featuring Hobgoblin before he was let go, and Hobgoblin toys were already in production. It's all about that merch, babe. There were also plans for an extended X-Men crossover arc, but those were scrapped when it became way too expensive to fly the X-Men voice actors from Canada to LA. Was this before frequent flyer miles were a thing? Unfortunately, the show was canceled amid disputes between ARAD and Fox Kids president Margaret Lesh, leaving certain plot points unresolved, most disappointingly, the whereabouts of Mary Jane.
Peter? Somebody, please! Help me!
In the ending to the series finale, Madam Web and Spidey finally decide it's time to look for Mary Jane. But, of course, we never get to see if they found her or not.
We are going to find the real Mary Jane Watson.
What?
It has been a long, hard journey.
Can we start a Kickstarter to fund one more episode? Outside of TV, the show was the basis for a line of toys as well as a video game for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. And for the creative kids among you, a personal favorite, there was also a Spider-Man cartoon maker for Windows PC. Spider-Man the animated series came during a very uncertain time for superheroes and genre stories. Marvel was in a state of near bankruptcy, yes, but the uncertainty was present all across the industry. If you had told people then that Comic-Con was going to become the largest pop culture event in the world in the new millennium, they would have laughed you right out of Hall H. Just look at Avi Arad. In 1994, he was producing terrific but niche cartoons like X-Men and Spider-Man. Now he's got his name blazoned across thousands of screens all over the world as a producer on a ton of Marvel movies.
Well, that's Hollywood for you.
Kids today are really lucky to have the MCU, the most popular movies in the world, to introduce them to the near endlessly expansive world of superhero comics. But for the people who relied on shows like Spider-Man to show them the ropes in a world where superhero geekdom was much smaller, these cartoons are very special. If not for this show, I probably would have never picked up a Spidey comic as a kid. What do you guys think? Any cool trivia that we didn't know? Got any idea where the Mary Jane went? Let us know in the comments.
Guess that's a wrap.
If you like that, make sure you subscribe to watch old episodes as well as new ones, which post every other week. Okay, bye.